Sometimes, when I close my eyes at night, I can still smell the faint traces of my childhood home: old leather, oven-warmed bread, and the subtle whiff of simmering resentment. In those cramped rooms, I witnessed the difference between how my parents treated me and how they lavished attention on my sister Anna as though I were an unimportant afterthought. Whenever Anna needed something, piano lessons, a new dress, or even a ride across town at midnight, my parents sprang into action, pouring every resource and devotion into her comfort and success. As for me, I grew used to finding my own way, patching the holes in my clothes and learning to cook simple meals while I was still just a child. That relentless disparity gnawed at me, though I tried to bury it under layers of self-sufficiency, convincing myself that independence made me stronger and less vulnerable to their ongoing neglect. Over the years, I watched Anna blossom into a charming woman who believed the world owed her every comfort, while I learned how to make do with whatever scraps remained. Despite the constant comparisons and occasional contempt, I clung to hope that someday my parents would see me, truly see me, and acknowledge that I, too, was deeply worth loving. That day never arrived, and by the time I moved out at 18, I promised myself I would never beg for their approval or chase after their displays of affection. It was both liberating and terrifying to leave everything familiar behind, but the knowledge that nobody would overshadow me in my own space gave me an exhilarating sense of peace. For years, I worked menial jobs to put myself through college, using the leftover hours to study late into the night, driven by a need to prove my own worth. In phone conversations, my mother would rush to share Anna's latest triumph, a prestigious internship, a new condo in the city, while barely asking how I was managing my rent or groceries. My father sometimes chimed in with half-hearted inquiries about my life, but it was clear that what really excited him was describing Anna's string of boyfriends or her dinner parties. I discovered, through social media, that Anna flaunted her charmed existence at every turn, filtering her photos to perfection, writing captions, and soaking up likes like a queen holding court. Meanwhile, I toiled in a cubicle at a small financial firm, paying off student loans and learning the delicate art of blending into the background so nobody would question me. It felt unfair, but that was the pattern of my life, so I pushed resentment aside and pretended it didn't matter, while inside, I fanned the embers of quiet bitterness. The years passed, and I found a small circle of friends who knew my quirks and my struggles, offering a kind of emotional refuge that I never received at home. Through their support and my own determination, I climbed slowly up the corporate ladder, negotiating for raises and promotions, all without ever expecting a word of praise from my parents. Nobody said it aloud, but I knew I was more resilient than Anna, that each setback had toughened me, forging armor that allowed me to withstand life's smaller, daily disappointments. I lost track of how many times I wondered whether my parents might ever regret neglecting me, if a day would come when their devotion to Anna would spark consequences. I never wished harm on anyone, but the idea that their favoritism might come back to haunt them sometimes lulled me to sleep with a smile tugging at my lips. Eventually, the day arrived when my parents discovered that Anna's charmed existence was more fragile than they had imagined, and they found themselves drowning in the aftermath of her abandonment. It started with a phone call late one evening, my mother's voice trembling as she explained that Anna had refused to lend them money to pay off a medical bill. Apparently, Anna claimed that her finances were tight and she couldn't spare a dime, though a quick glance at her social media showed her enjoying vacations and designer shopping sprees. I listened in stunned silence as my mother's voice broke, begging me to help because the hospital demanded payment, and my father's insurance had lapsed due to an administrative mishap. In that moment, a complex mix of pity, anger, and vindication surged through me, each emotion battling to define my response, but I forced my voice to remain unnaturally calm. I told my mother I'd think about it and call back, then hung up, my heart pounding as old wounds ripped open, releasing feelings I'd spent years trying to bury. For hours, I paced my small apartment, replaying memories of holiday dinners where Anna sat at the head of the table while I served plates or washed dishes without complaint. I recalled birthdays spent alone, unwrapping practical gifts I'd purchased for myself, while Anna showcased the jewelry my parents claimed they couldn't afford to buy me, even if they wanted. The more I thought about their request, the more I understood that this was my chance to reclaim a fragment of dignity, to show them exactly how it truly felt. Still, I wrestled with guilt. wondering if stooping to their level would make me just as callous, yet I couldn't ignore the satisfaction sparking in the corners of my mind. By morning, I called them back and agreed to meet, requesting they come to my apartment rather than some neutral cafe because I wanted them to see my entire reality. When they arrived, I noticed my father's limp and the shadows under my mother's eyes, signs of their vulnerability that both angered and softened me, sparking a complex emotional conflict. My mother tearfully recounted the mounting bills, how Anna had turned them away without a single comforting word, and how they'd realized they had truly nobody else to rely on. My father, quieter than I remembered, stared at his hands, which had once built my sister's science fair projects, while refusing to help me craft even the simplest cardboard model. Images flooded my mind, him crouched next to Anna, painting solar system planets with her, while I sat across the room with tears in my eyes, completely invisible to them. They apologized in halting sentences, as though unsure how to form words of remorse for a lifetime of casual dismissal, and I let them speak without offering any meaningful reassurance. When the moment felt right, I cleared my throat and told them I could help, but my support would come with conditions, terms that would be binding and strictly enforced. They looked startled, perhaps expecting unconditional charity, yet desperation made them nod, so I outlined the arrangement. I would cover the medical bills, but they must sign a formal contract. In that document, they would acknowledge the sum borrowed, agree to repay with interest, and relinquish any further claims to my assistance if they failed to meet the strict deadlines. My father opened his mouth to protest, but the sight of my gaze silenced him, and my mother shakily agreed, signing away the last shred of parental authority they possessed. In the weeks that followed, I set up a payment plan with the hospital, used my savings to clear the debts, and forwarded every receipt to my parents for transparency. They thanked me profusely at first, but their gratitude was laced with discomfort, as though each polite phrase tasted bitter, a reminder that their golden daughter had completely deserted them. I learned that Anna had fled to Europe with a new boyfriend, ghosting our parents when they mentioned her share of responsibility, ignoring messages, and changing phone numbers without explanation. Part of me felt an odd admiration for her nerve, but mostly, I reveled in the irony. The child they had cherished was now the one inflicting the deepest betrayal. Still, her actions didn't erase the scars she'd helped inflict, and I saw my parents' predicament as cosmic payback, their illusions of favoritism unraveling in the harsh light of reality. As the medical bills stabilized, I launched the repayment schedule, emailing them a formal invoice each month, complete with interest calculations that reminded them kindness now had a price tag. At first, they tried to meet these demands promptly, perhaps hoping to restore some semblance of normalcy, but their funds dwindled, and soon they fell behind, missing deadline after deadline. My mother left tearful voicemails, promising partial payments once her disability checks arrived, while my father's pride led him to avoid speaking at all, a silent admission of stark failure. A twisted part of me enjoyed watching them scramble, reminded of every time I'd scraped by alone, longing for even a hint of support they had so freely given Anna. Yet guilt seeped through my bravado, catching me off guard when I heard my mother sob or saw my father's name appear on my phone, his voice trembling with hopelessness. One rainy evening, they showed up unannounced, rain-soaked and shaking, pleading for more time, explaining how difficult it was to keep pace with the relentless schedule I'd so carefully constructed. I invited them in, brewed tea, and sat across the table, remembering the countless nights I'd waited for a small gesture of comfort that never arrived, feeling a strange reversal. With measured calm, I reminded them that the terms were unambiguous, just as their favoritism had been, and that empathy was not something one could demand after years of neglect. They stared at me with heartbreak etched into their expressions, and for a fleeting instant, I imagined my younger self finally receiving an apology sincere enough to mend old scars. But even then, the apology was tainted by their desperation, not a genuine acknowledgement of past wrongs, and I realized I no longer cared whether they felt remorse or not. They left, heads bowed, murmuring thanks, promising to do better, leaving behind a trail of damp footprints and a residue of sorrow that clung to the walls of my apartment. In the ensuing weeks, I heard rumors that my parents had sold heirlooms, downsized their lifestyle, and even considered renting out a portion of their house to cover the repayments. Part of me was amazed they would go to such lengths for my money, but another part remembered I was the child who got leftover love, if any at all. Eventually, they missed enough payments that the contract stipulated immediate settlement, or I could seize their assets if they defaulted completely, an option that both terrified and secretly thrilled me. At the final deadline, they arrived on my doorstep one last time, cheeks hollow, eyes desperate, offering their rundown car as collateral, surrendering the very symbol of their former mobility. I watched them from the living room window, recalling how they'd never given me a ride unless Anna was already in the passenger seat. And now they stood powerless, begging. That final transaction felt like a line I couldn't uncross. Accepting their car meant slicing away their last shred of independence, completely confining them to the mercy of public transportation. A memory flickered of me walking miles from school because Anna needed the car, my parents insisting I was old enough to manage without their help, while she was not. I accepted the keys, ignoring the tremor in my mother's hands, and scrawled my signature on the paperwork, each pen stroke carving a deeper gulf between us. Irreversible, cold, final. They thanked me again, voices faint, and trudged away, leaving me holding a set of worn car keys and a swirl of emotions that threatened to consume me from inside. For days, I couldn't sleep, utterly haunted by flashes of my father's defeated stance, my mother's tear-streaked cheeks, and that unwavering sense of justice that told me they deserved it. One evening, I found myself driving their old sedan aimlessly around the city, the engine sputtering at stoplights, the worn upholstery smelling like faint, cheap air freshener and distant regret. I remembered being a child in that back seat, overshadowed by Anna's chatter, my parents laughing with her while I stared out the window, wishing they'd turn around and see me. Now I held the power, and it filled me with a sorrowful triumph, like a lonely victory parade where I marched alone, flanked by painful, ghostly banners of lingering heartbreak. As the city lights blurred by, I wondered if I had become something worse than them, using their weakness against them, or if I was simply balancing the cosmic scales. A few days later, they called to say they were relocating to a cheaper apartment, and I felt a deep pang in my chest, a mixture of guilt and vindication. I wondered if they'd try to contact Anna, beg for her assistance, but apparently she was unreachable, a phantom who had severed ties with the very people who worshipped her. In quiet moments, I reflected on how my parents' downfall was orchestrated by their own hands, shaped by years of preferential treatment that warped Anna's sense of responsibility and empathy. Rather than building unity, they'd sown a dynamic of entitlement, and now the favored child had utterly abandoned them, forcing them to rely on the son they'd always considered second-rate. Friends told me I should forgive, that carrying anger would poison my soul, but I saw forgiveness as a door leading straight back into the deeply ingrained patterns of neglect. I refused to revert to that powerless child who begged for scraps of love, so I held fast to my boundaries, letting them experience the consequences of their own design. And though a quiet sadness settled in my chest at times, I stood taller, feeling more self-respect than ever, knowing I wasn't obligated to mend what they had irreparably broken. My parents' calls became less frequent, and when they did reach out, it was businesslike, focusing on payments and schedules, as though the emotional chasm between us was too vast. I never asked how they were managing, never offered time, just as they had never checked if I had enough to eat or a safe place to sleep each night. In a twist, I learned that Anna had married her boyfriend overseas, oblivious to the wreckage she'd left behind, and my parents stood alone, indebted to the child they'd undervalued. Time slipped by, turning weeks into months, and eventually the entire debt was repaid, though the real cost remained unspoken, carved into our fractured bonds beyond any possible easy repair. After that final payment, my parents stopped calling altogether, and I didn't reach out either, content to let the silence stand as a testament to lines now permanently firmly drawn. Sometimes I drove their old car through familiar streets, past the house where I'd grown up, remembering how the walls seemed to echo Anna's laughter while mine was barely heard. It still felt surreal to realize I owned the vehicle that once ferried Anna to fancy classes and competitions, a physical trophy of a twisted triumph over years of neglect. Eventually, I found a new job in another state, packed my few belongings, and prepared to leave those painful memories behind, hoping to craft a future without their lingering shadows. Before I left, I drove to my parents' tiny apartment, parked outside for a moment, and debated whether to knock on the door to see if they wanted a goodbye. I never moved from the driver's seat, my knuckles whitening on the steering wheel, torn between pity and the knowledge that any gesture might unravel what little peace I'd gained. In the end, I turned the key, letting the engine rattle to life, and drove away without a backward glance, leaving them to their regrets, just as they'd left me. The new city offered fresh opportunities, and though I carried the scars of my past, I channeled them into a determination to prove I was worth every success and happiness. I found an apartment filled with sunlight, decorated its walls with art I'd chosen, savoring each small freedom that reminded me nobody could overshadow me here. Not anymore. Not ever. Sometimes I thought about Anna, flitting around Europe, oblivious to the chaos she'd left in her wake, convinced she was entitled to luxury while her family unraveled in her absence. I doubted she'd ever realize or care about the fallout of her actions, content in her curated world of social media applause, floating through life untouched by consequence or guilt. And maybe that was her punishment, the hollowness of a life without genuine connections, while I, scarred but healing, had forged a path on my own terms and clear conscience. Over time, people asked about my family, and I'd offer a polite half-truth, saying we weren't close, never delving into the labyrinth of favoritism that had deeply shaped my childhood. I saw no point in trying to justify old wounds or unravel the complexities to strangers, so I let them assume whatever they wanted, keeping my victories and defeats hidden. Every now and then, my phone would display my mother's number, but I ignored the calls, not out of spite, but a certainty that reopening wounds would serve no purpose. Once, near Christmas, I found a voicemail of her sobbing, apologizing for everything, but the words felt hollow, a desperate attempt at absolution I was not ever obliged to give. I deleted it, feeling a pang that quickly morphed into steely resolve, reminding myself that giving in would erase the hard-won respect and resilience I'd cultivated through standing my ground. Eventually, those calls stopped too, and an expansive calm settled over my life, though traces of sorrow remained, the final echo of a family that had failed to be one. Even now, I stand by my choice, for betrayals run deep for absolution, and the sweetest revenge is living a life that needs no validation from those who overlooked you.